Ubuntu is the biggest distro out there. It had a transformative effect on the Linux desktop, taking it from hobbyist project to something that anyone can really use and learn to love in an enterprise, in private use, or at home. So basically, Ubuntu has tried to build the Linux desktop as something that everyone can use, and they had more or less success depending on the initiatives that they brought and the stuff that they developed. And they are still getting a ton of hate for most of the projects that they try to bring forward. So let's take a look at why Ubuntu is getting so much hate right after this. This video is sponsored by Linode, the largest independent cloud computing provider. Linode makes it easy to give your creations their own personal space on the internet. Just about everyone needs a website these days, and if you've tested out simple drag-and-drop website providers, you know they tend to lack customization, lock your website onto their platform, and charge extra for basic features. Linode makes it as easy as possible for you to deploy enterprise-grade WordPress, Drupal, or even static websites in just seconds using Linode's one-click apps. These apps are the same tools that businesses trust to truly own your content, make websites that are ultra-portable, and ensures you only pay for what you need. If you need something a little bit more powerful, Linode has now managed Kubernetes, and they are keeping their usual simple pricing model. There are no management fees like AWS and other cloud providers charge. They even bundle transfers, so you can significantly cut costs when compared to AWS, GCP, and Azure. With the amount you save, if you're using Kubernetes, it really doesn't make sense to use anyone but Linode. Sign up today at linode.com/linuxexperiment and get $20 in credit on your new Linode account. The link is in the description. Okay, so the first thing that comes often to mind is the fact that Ubuntu spies on its users. This stems from two moves that Ubuntu made in its earlier days. And those were the Amazon web app that they added and the data collection tool that they added at install. The Amazon thing was bad. The first thing it did was being integrated into the Unity dash, and while you search for stuff, the various Unity scopes gave you results for everything that you looked for, including some Amazon search results. These were super bad and not really well tailored to what you were looking for, and they sent an encrypted request to Amazon directly, which was terrible as well. And as time moved on, they allowed users to disable this integration into the dash, and progressively, as they phased out Unity, it just became a single web app with an affiliate link that gave Ubuntu a little commission on everything that you bought using this link. It finally disappeared from the latest versions of Ubuntu, which was well received by most users. I must say, this is not something that Ubuntu really should have pushed forwards. So obviously the goal here was monetization. Ubuntu wanted to make more money from its desktop users, which used the distribution for free. And this ruffled a few feathers, because people tend to associate using Linux and open source with gratuity and using stuff for free without paying any money. And while people do associate these are not linked at all. You can make a business out of open source software and you don't have to release everything that you do for free. You can ask for users to pay what they want, or you can fix a price that users have to pay. Ubuntu decided not to sell the distro, but to try and gain some money out of using affiliate links from Amazon. The implementation was clumsy, it was not the right move, they should have communicated more about this, but in the end I can understand why they wanted to add this. Now the second thing is the data collection. Ubuntu added in its installer, or in its first setup phase, a phase that lets you opt out of data collection. This data collection is limited to hardware elements only. You can even download a list of the stuff that will be sent to the Ubuntu servers. The goal here is to allow Ubuntu to better understand their users and know what hardware they use, what software they use, what kind of computer they have, but no private personal information is collected here. It's not going to log your user accounts, it's not going to log your name, it's not going to log your age or any of your preferences, it's just hardware information. The problem here was that it was opt-out instead of opt-in. But still, making this opt-out wouldn't mean that the Linux community would have accepted it, because KDE tried it. They shipped a data collection engine disabled by default that you can really tailor to ship some very little amounts of data to very huge amounts of data about your hardware and your usage. But still, you can enable it. You have to enable it. And the Linux community just went nuts about this again, because they are very privacy sensitive, and that's a good thing. But it also tends to some overreactions from time to time, and I think this was one in this case. The data that Ubuntu collected was not meaningful, it was not personal, and it shouldn't have been treated as an invasion of privacy. Now, the second thing that often gets brought up is that Ubuntu tries to reinvent the wheel and suffers from the not invented here syndrome. And the projects that people most often refer to are Unity and Mir. So these are two projects that Ubuntu launched and that have completely failed, or at least have been put on the back burner from the Ubuntu team and are just now used in the open source community, but are not pushed specifically by Ubuntu or Canonical. Unity was a desktop environment that Canonical and Ubuntu tried to push at the time where GNOME moved to GNOME 3, and Mir was a window compositor, a desktop compositor that aimed to replace the x.org server that is used to display Windows on your desktop. Both of these projects took some flack from the community, but you have to consider the reasons why Ubuntu tried to push these projects instead of using what was already out there. Now you have to consider that at the time, the competing projects were not able to do what Ubuntu or Canonical wanted them to do. They were far from ready. For Mir, for example, the competitor was Wayland, and Wayland is just a protocol, it's not an implementation. At the time, its implementation, called Weston, was not ready at all. It just didn't fit the criteria that Ubuntu wanted for its convergence and its unification of the desktop and the mobile operating system. They had to build something from scratch, or at least based on the Wayland protocol as well, to be more modular and work as well on a desktop and on a mobile device. Mir specifically was working on a less modular design than what Weston was working, because they wanted to relegate as many systems and as many tasks to the server instead of the client, just to make sure that these things could run well, that Mir and the windows it would display, and the animations, and the focus, and the switching from windows to applications would use less hardware, and that could work well on a desktop as well on an ARM device, a small smartphone-powered device. And at the time, Weston and Wayland and x.org didn't fit those criteria. Now Unity, on the other hand, was created because at the time, GNOME 3 was an unusable mess. A lot of distributions, when GNOME 3 was first introduced, completely switched off from GNOME for a long time, moving to KDE or moving to something else. GNOME 3 was a real departure in terms of usage, in terms of workings, and users used to GNOME 2 would have been completely lost using GNOME 3. The activities concept, there was no taskbar, there was no dock, there were no app menus. People were just completely lost by this, and Ubuntu and Canonical did not want to impose that on their users, and that's why they wanted to create their own thing. And they did it pretty quickly with Unity, with some problems at first, but it ran very well later on, and it's still praised as a very good desktop environment these days. You can still run it on Ubuntu today. It's a very good thing that they built here. They ended up abandoning it because they tried to build the Unity for Convergence thing, and when they forgot about these plans about convergence, making the desktop or the mobile phone turn into a desktop when you plug it into a monitor, when they forgot about these plans, they also abandoned Unity and moved back to GNOME 3, which was a lot more ready to be used in production than what it was when Unity was first introduced. So sure, you can hate on Ubuntu and Canonical for introducing their own stuff and splitting the development efforts in the community instead of working on improving GNOME 3, working on making Unity. But at the time, the vision that Canonical had for the desktop was completely incompatible with what the GNOME team wanted, which means that their efforts could not have been transferred upstream. It just wouldn't have worked, so they had to build something else or use KDE or another system. They decided to build something else, and they don't deserve to get hate for that. Now, I think the problem here, and what generates a lot of hate towards Ubuntu and Canonical, is that these projects were abandoned later. So not only did they split the community's efforts in terms of development and developer time, but they also made this for nothing, because these projects were basically abandoned by Ubuntu and Canonical. You can still run them, some teams still try and maintain them, but they are not big Ubuntu projects anymore. And as such, they did them for nothing when they abandoned their vision for convergence, for making some mobile hardware turn into a desktop. They also abandoned these projects that had no purpose anymore for them. But in the end, I don't think we should criticize distros for trying to reinvent the wheel, because basically what they're doing is rarely reinventing the wheel. They're reinventing a project that they want from a vision that they have and that cannot fit with the upstream contributions and the upstream teams. And that's what Ubuntu has done, and I don't think they should be getting any hate for that. Now, snaps are another controversial point in the Linux community. It's the most recent one, and it's the one that people get the most aggressive about. Snaps are just a way to distribute applications, to package them, and to not be dependent on the whole dependency system and the old package manager issues that we have. You just package it once and you can run it everywhere. It's basically the equivalent to Flatpak, but that Ubuntu built. And Ubuntu and Canonical are getting a ton of flack for creating and using snaps. Mostly because they are slow to load, they don't respect the user's theme, and they use mount points. Really, people get pissed about this. They use mount points to mount applications. And these complaints are valid. The one that isn't is that snaps are proprietary. This is complete bogus. Snaps themselves are completely open source, and you can use them to package open source apps, and using snaps does not mean that snaps are proprietary or that your system has proprietary software. The proprietary component is the distribution method itself, which is the snap store, the Snapcraft store. And there are reasons for that. The reason is that Ubuntu doesn't want multiple stores and repos popping up. They want to keep one store available where all snaps are available. And if you make the backend open source, everybody can create their own snap repo, and you get the same problem as multiple PPAs, multiple repositories. Even though snaps won't enter into conflict with each other, they cannot make sure that applications are available everywhere. And that's what they want to do with snaps. They want companies to package their software through the Snap Store and distribute them to every single user that use the Snap Store. And that's only possible if you have one distribution point. You don't want to have a snap repo for the Oracle software, the snap repo for Slack, a snap repo for Spotify. You want one repository where all the apps are available, and as such, they don't really want to open this up because they don't want multiple repos popping up everywhere. And as a company, I can understand that. Like, I want to distribute my software where people can get it, and when I can have insurance that my software is not next to multiple copycats, repackagings of my own software. I want to make sure that the stuff that I distribute is not completely freely available everywhere, because most companies don't do open source software. And we do need some proprietary software yet on our distributions. That's an unpopular opinion, but that's the truth. If Adobe ever decided to bring their Linux software, they wouldn't bring it through Flatpak. They would bring it through Snap if they had to choose a distribution method between these two. That's what companies will want to use, and that's probably the reason behind what Ubuntu is doing here. So yes, this store component is proprietary, but there are good reasons about this. You can hate that and not like that, and Ubuntu definitely deserves your hate if you hate proprietary software for this. But in the end, there's a reason that it's just not a blind move to make the Ubuntu community accept proprietary software. It's not a blind move to make stuff proprietary. Ubuntu is not going to turn into Microsoft. They just want to keep some things locked down because the purpose behind it means that for now, open sourcing the Snap Store is just not an option. And now there are other reasons, less expected or less often seen, for why Ubuntu gets so much hate. And I think the main one is that Ubuntu is the big dog. Ubuntu is the big distro. Most people working in IT will have heard of Ubuntu, but probably won't have heard of Arch or Manjaro or anything like that. People used to Windows might have heard of Ubuntu and think that Linux is Ubuntu, but they won't have heard of your Edge distro. Maybe not Elementary OS, probably not Arch, probably not Manjaro. They will have heard of Ubuntu. And some parts of the Linux community just like to be edgy. They want to be the hipsters of the tech community. They want to use stuff that people don't know about or don't use. And Ubuntu is starting to get some traction. It has a good market share, it is known, and people don't really want to use that anymore because they think it's a noob system, it's noob friendly, it's geared towards beginners, and they don't want to fall in that camp anymore. They want to be on the edge, they want to be like on top, and using Ubuntu basically makes them use Windows again. It's like, yeah, you're a regular user. You use Ubuntu or you use Windows. You're a basic user. And they don't want to feel like that. And that's complete bogus as well, because Ubuntu is not specifically geared towards beginner. It's just a user-friendly distro. It doesn't mean that it's for noobs. It doesn't mean that it limits you compared to what other distros offer. It's just a Linux distribution. And the fact that it's well known and that people use them more than many other distros doesn't mean that it's bad. And the second reason is probably that Ubuntu is backed by Canonical. Canonical is a corporation, and in the Linux community, corporations equal bad. And they often forget that Red Hat is also the backing behind Fedora as well, and that OpenSUSE has a company, Manjaro has a company behind it, Elementary OS has a company behind it. Basically, when you want to start making money out of your work and your Linux distro, you have to have a company for tax purposes and for making the money that you make. So yes, most big Linux distros have a company, and while some people might not like Canonical, they are a big Linux company that is doing a good work to make Linux well known, to make Linux exist in the IT sphere, and to push Linux on the server and on the desktop side. So hating them for having a company is like hating Fedora for having Red Hat behind them, or hating Manjaro for having created a company. It's just nonsense. So these are the main reasons why I think Ubuntu is getting so much hate online, and why I think most of these reasons are complete bogus and are just taken back by people that don't really fully understand the context or the solution. And if you don't like Ubuntu, it's fine. You don't have to. You don't have to like Ubuntu. Ubuntu is not for everyone. Ubuntu is not a distro that you have to use. It's still a huge and interesting base for most Linux distributions out there. It's the base for Elementary OS, which I use, and I cannot thank them enough for making this available and for working on the Linux desktop as a whole, for trying to push new ideas, new projects, trying to solve some issues that we had for a long time. I think they are doing a good job. They are doing great work. And even if they had some missteps, they have existed for more than 16 years now, building Linux distros. You're bound to make some mistakes in that time. And those mistakes don't affect the regular users every day. So let's not be ridiculous. Let's try to accept the differences and accept that stuff that we don't like can also exist. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. What are your opinions on Ubuntu? Do you use it? Do you like it? Do you hate it? If you hate it, why? Do you think my reasons are valid or my explanations are valid or not? Let me know down there in the comments. If you really did like the video, don't hesitate to check out my Patreon page or to join the YouTube channel using the join button, which only appears on desktop, I think, and see what perks you can get from that. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!